progress is never guaranteed. Warburton of Reuters 24 finds that congressional action has hit new lows with only 27 bills passing last year as polarization only increases. But it doesn't have to be like this. Although Hamilton of Indiana University 23 notes that the inherent structure of Congress forces slow action, Moe of Stanford 18 highlights that presidential executive action can drive forward solutions as Congress gets tied in the webs of bureaucracy. Thus, to ensure America's prosperity, 1237 affirms, our sole contention is crisis response. Despite recently recovering from the pandemic, we aren't out of the woods just yet. The JRC 24 warns that within the last decade, the risk of hazards, conflicts, and chaos has nearly doubled. And more often than not, the average citizen is hit the hardest. Lightman 25 laments that in Hawaii and North Carolina, where natural disasters devastated local communities, congressional aid arrived 18 months too late, as rebuilding efforts were tied up in politics. Thankfully, alternative solutions do exist. Fierro 21 explains that instead of waiting for Congress to debate their differences, executive orders allow the president to respond to crises while the clock is ticking. And despite fears, this isn't a system of unchecked unilateral power. Rudelovich of Princeton 21 analyzes 100 years of data, spanning 500 executive orders, and explains that while put forward by the president, these orders are shaped by federal agencies and negotiations across the executive branch. Represent Us 25 even furthers that from Congress to courts to succeeding administrations, executive orders that cross the line are often struck down. Consequently, when Trump attempted to push forward his own agenda through executive action, political analyst Cannon 25 notes that he's lost 75% of his rulings in federal courts. Thus, because executive orders can't promote individual interests, Wiley 23 concludes that these actions are primarily used to aid the nation in times of crises. And the efforts have been successful, with the impacts being twofold. Firstly, the economy. Executive action has changed America's trajectory. In times of recession, Penders of Johns Hopkins 23 notes that executive orders are used to suspend regulations, control prices, and provide financial aid to those who need it the most. In fact, when looking back to America's economic crisis in 2020, Egan of NBC 21 celebrates that Biden used executive orders to increase food assistance programs by 15%, raise minimum wages, and provide stimulus checks, offering a crucial lifeline to millions. Even at the core of our economy, executive action has set the nation's blueprints. Professor Pierce 18 documents that during America's 1980s economic crisis, Reagan ordered federal agencies to implement cost-benefit analysis into economic regulations, a system that laid the foundation for trillions in GDP growth and continues to drive economic policy today. But such executive actions are not solely economic. Secondly, when looking at pandemic response, executive orders facilitate progress in times of panic. For example, when prior administrations withdrew the U.S. from the global sphere, the UN 21 finds that Biden signed an executive order to maintain America's standing within the WHO, which Gostin 20 explains was critical in America's production and distribution of vaccines during COVID. Furthermore, during Trump's very first term, Kellogg 21 corroborates that the executive action sped up the vaccine production process, allowing the U.S. to vaccinate nearly 8 million additional Americans in just a single year. Dr. Fitzpatrick of Yale 22 even confirms that such action saved 3 million lives. Even outside of vaccines, Stolberg 21 finds that Biden used executive action to reopen the Affordable Care Act, which Bowers of NIH 21 quantifies provided 15 million Americans with access to Medicaid. When crisis strikes, decisive action saves lives. And time again, executive orders have proven to be decisive, safeguarding the lives of millions of Americans. Thus, to preserve American prosperity, 1237 is proud to affirm.
We see two pieces of evidence. One is 75% of Trump's rulings, and then the second is all the evidence on Reagan's 1980s economics.
Of course.
Just for a brief introduction, we're code 1215, and you're on the vacation speaking second in this debate. My name is Selma Barani, and I'll be speaking first. Is anyone not ready to begin? Perfect. From the start, our founders built a government for balance, not one-man rule. Congress was meant to represent every voice, and the president was never meant to govern alone. But that balance is fading as presidents increasingly bypass Congress and rule by executive order. Thus, 1215 negates. Our sole argument is executive overreach. As Hebe of Villanova Law explains, executive orders were meant to allow the president to carry out Congress's will. For a while, that vision was upheld. Purcell in 2025 notes that George Washington issued just 8 executive orders and they were used sparingly, not as a form of daily governance. But that line began to blur. As the nation expanded, executive orders shifted from necessity to convenience. Regulatory expert Dan Bosch noted that presidents stopped waiting for Congress and began acting alone. In the past 5 decades, they've averaged 260 orders per term, using a tool once meant to serve democracy to now sidestep it. To be clear, we are not saying all executive orders have been bad, but the pattern of their overuse erodes the foundation of our democracy. And today that poses 2 very significant harms. The first is bypassing Congress. Congress does 3 things executive orders never can. The first is that Congress holds public hearings, calling experts, and asks hard questions that examine every aspect of a policy. The second is that Maryland University finds it brings together voices from every state and background, red and blue, urban and rural, accurately representing our nation and not just one individual agenda. Third, while executive orders may deliver quick wins, long-lasting progress comes only through negotiation and compromise. When we skip this process, people get hurt. Health experts warned against cutting HIV aid, Congress listened, and the president didn't. That's why GHP in 2025 reports that 1 executive order slashed HIV aid, leading to 100,000 preventable deaths. But when we trust the system, lives are saved. In 2017, Congress passed the ACE Kids Act with bipartisan support. Cornell University found it helped 300,000 children get critical care across state lines. The second net harm is regressive reversals. Once a president signs an executive order, checks are scarce. Congress has overturned only a handful, and the Supreme Court has struck down fewer than a dozen in over 230 years. By the time they act, the damage is already done. As the ACLU warns, even reckless orders go unchecked if they're technically legal. This leeway has distorted the original purpose of executive orders. Biron Tao of the Associated Press found that nearly 1/5 of the last 150 executive orders cited a national emergency, a sharp rise signaling a shift in how presidents govern. What was once true for crisis is now used to bypass Congress and push stalled agendas. It's not just overuse, it's instability. The Congressional Research Service reports presidents issue twice as many orders in their final months, driven by politics, not policy. And because new presidents can reverse them instantly via another executive order, the result is constant policy whiplash. National Affairs estimates this has already cost the U.S. economy $1.7 trillion. But the impact isn't just economic. Brownstein from AP writes that redoing climate regulation between administrations has left companies confused. Instability from re-entering and withdrawing from the Paris Agreement has caused 25,000 deaths from emissions each year. Karkako from NYT furthers that since Obama has passed DACA, an immigration policy for children, each administration has reversed it again and again, leaving 135 million without a future. Professor Goldstein writes, President Truman's executive order created loyalty review boards enabling the Red Scare. It led to 12,000 public servants being fired and imprisoned on whispers of communist affiliation, a devastating mistake that Truman himself later admitted he hadn't thought through. There's a line between leadership and convenience. Unchecked executive power doesn't just bypass Congress, it erodes democracy. For these reasons, 1215 proudly negates.
have the first question. All right. When Trump recently issued ICE raids and the public condemned him for his actions through executive orders, how did Trump respond?
Trump.
Yeah.
I'm sure that he pushed the agenda.
No, he rolled back the ICE raids because he realized that the voters and the public condemned him for those raids. Doesn't that mean that the public does have a say in the executive orders that are being passed?
No. But
Why?
I would like to ask a question.
Sure.
So you agree that some of Trump's executive orders have already had real damages in today's world, deporting people via deportations, but other bills as well.
So
you say that it's overturned by the courts, but you miss this really key concession that by the time that it takes the courts to actually overturn the executive order, the damage is already done.
Yeah.
That's why we see that with a lot of these executive orders, like how Trump recently, just a couple of days ago, passed an executive order that allows healthcare agencies to deny veterans like any sort of healthcare based off their political party. That means that order is already in effect right now until the courts overturn it, and they haven't yet.
These
So
are
you're
great
trying to say
examples. If I
it is
could
a great
answer your
example
question,
because you're trying to say that if
I
they've
can
changed
answer
their
your question.
I'm not.
There are things
I'm answering
like
your question.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're trying to talk about what exactly it means when the orders are like facing backlash, right? But I'm saying that until their checks are actually put into place, the damage is already done.
You're
Can
missing
I take the question?
really quickly because this is really important. You're missing pieces of the puzzle. Executive orders have things like preliminary injunctions in place that actually ensure that these prior damages don't always go through.
Hold
which
on,
is why
that's
wait.
not true.
If I could
What was
continue
the most
speaking, if
recent
I could
arrest that
continue
was just on the
speaking, if I could
news?
continue.
Yeah, go ahead, continue.
That's why when Trump tried to do things like ban funding to sanctuary cities, it was halted then overturned. When he tried to do things like ban birthright citizenship, it was halted then overturned. We are not saying that every single executive order is perfect, but rather, sure, it can be abused under some specific administrations, but the overall benefits massively outweigh the harms.
That's a great explanation, but I would say at the point where we've already seen the New York City electoral candidate get arrested.
And millions of Americans saved from,
You just
like,
spoke for a minute, so
sure.
I'm going to keep speaking now.
Go ahead.
We've already seen that there have been 25,000 deaths because of emissions from continuously reversing and reinstating climate policy. That damage is not reversible. You can't just say that because we are changing direction now, the fact that 25,000 people have died every single. I'm still trying to finish speaking, please. That doesn't mean that those deaths don't matter, but now you can continue.
Yeah, so absent executive orders, let's do the comparative. Millions of Americans would have died from COVID, and millions more wouldn't have money in their pockets to put food on their tables. You can cite me as many bad examples as you want and tell me some thousands of people have died. That is great, or not great, but sure, thanks for giving me those examples.
Okay.
But our argument is that absent executive orders, on net, the world would be worse.
Yeah, but I would say that you're missing one key fact.
Sure.
The executive branch wasn't the only one who was acting during COVID. We saw that Congress was actually able to pass 3 stimulus checks that were better than the executive order. But we'll get to that in speech. Yeah.
That was 12 seconds.
Yep.
For the judges, I'm the second speaker on the pro of 1237. This is going to be my 4-minute rebuttal speech. Are all my judges ready? The order of this speech is simply going to be going down my notes. my time begins. Decisive action saves lives. In times of crisis, when you have seen congressional lawmaking fall behind and get tied up in the webs of bureaucracy, time and time again, we see different executive actions are the ones that pulls us out of the pit. 8 million Americans have been vaccinated because of executive orders, and 15 million Americans were insured during the COVID pandemic because of executive orders. These are empirics you cannot simply refuse because they cite one or two bad examples. In times of crisis, it is executive action that we need. At the top, they try to tell you that there's lots of executive overreach, and over time, executive orders have increased. They are fundamentally wrong about this fact. Our Grossman evidence tells you that over the last 75 years, the number of executive orders have decreased. In fact, if you look at the last 5 administrations, from Clinton to Biden, each one passed less executive orders than the last. That means their argument about executive order reach is fundamentally untrue. Look it up in the Federal Register. But secondly, let's talk about abuse. They try to tell you that Congress is a lot better because they have a lot more checks and balances, and they have to talk a lot more. We agree, they do have to talk a lot more, but that's all they do. They talk and pass no legislation. Time and time again, we showed you that just last year, they have passed 27 bills, down far more from the hundreds of bills that used to pass decades ago. That's why in times of crisis like the pandemic or recessions, we don't see them passing aid. That's why in the second round of stimulus checks during COVID, Congress was unable to pass because they were gridlocked. Hundreds of lawmakers were unable to decide on where the funds should go. During this time, Trump passed 4 executive actions that saved the lives of millions of Americans. Now, they try to give you a bunch of examples in which we're not representing the people and executive orders aren't representative. However, we would argue voter support also repeals executive orders. It's another check. If you look to the ICE rates right now, because of disproportions in constituencies that didn't like the ICE rates, we're seeing some of them being rolled back. Trump knows that if the PP loses the voter support, he cannot pass more actions, which is why voters are the reason that he's repealing actions. But secondly, let's go to specific examples. They tell us example about slashing HIV cuts led to 300,000 deaths. Look at the actual evidence. Brooke Nichols is a mathematician who created a hypothetical study of how many people dies. In fact, their very own author indicts the study and says there's no way to tell the exact number of people that died to AIDS cuts. It's completely projectionary. Look at the evidence that you do know. Millions of Americans were saved from specifically executive orders. That's what you're voting on. Secondly, they just cite you one other Congress bill that saved lives. That's great. It's one of the 27. We'd argue executive orders are a lot more better. Go to whiplash. First of all, 75% of executive orders are never revoked. That's Lawande, a Michigan University professor that analyzed 6,500 executive orders over 65 years. That's very, very clear evidence that proves to you that they overblow the problem. Also, let's think about this realistically. 8 million Americans being vaccinated cannot be overturned. It already happened. We already saved those lives. 15 million Americans who are relying on medical insurance for their lives to be saved cannot be overturned. We already saved those lives. Think about this argument logically. They don't overturn any of our impacts. But secondly, they tell you the economy tanks when there's overturns of investments. First of all, we would argue the best executive orders still stay strong. Things like Reagan's economic order that saved trillions in GDP growth tried to get repealed by Trump, but it didn't happen. But secondly, if their argument was true, you would see massive fluctuations in investment and recessions every 4 years when the administration switches places. That just fundamentally doesn't happen. That's because there's independent things like the federal judiciary, Federal Reserve, and state and local regulations that make sure the economy doesn't collapse just because an executive order is overturned. Secondly, we'd argue there's checks and balances on executive orders. They tell you only a dozen have been overturned. The evidence is from 2002. Our more recent evidence finds Trump lost 75% of court rulings, specifically highlighting that he's being checked by the courts right now. The ones that haven't been ruled on have preliminary injunctions, specifically on this argument about the climate. All of their evidence is projectionary. If you look to actual history, Biden passed executive orders that decreased emissions by 38%, which is why right now we're seeing emissions going down. Look to history, not the hypotheticals. If you want to save American lives, you're voting affirmative.
Yeah. You see them. Actually, our arguments, and then I'll talk about their arguments. So the order is going to go from con to pro. Executive orders were once a tool to serve democracy, but now they're being used to displace the very institution itself. They have said that EOs are actually decreasing over time, but that's not true. In fact, the increase is actually recent. For example, President Trump has signed a record executive order, and also they are not analyzing when these executive orders are signed. The reason why Biden had a slight decrease is because he was a lame duck coming out of office, but during his first acts as president, he signed a record number of executive orders, and also when he left, because he didn't care, and it proves that presidents are only enacting their own unilateral agenda, which is why over the past 150 executive orders, 1/5 of them have been cited as national emergencies, even when there isn't any crisis. I'll address all the checks arguments on their case. They say that our study on HIV plus is hypothetical. The 300,000 dying is not a hypothetical. That is a projection. But they have conceded that right now, 100,000 people have already died from HIV because, and think about it logically, USAID and HIV funding is critical for people and international wide. But when Trump reversed these executive orders because we didn't listen to Congress or didn't listen to health experts, people got hurt and there's no recovering from it. Rather, the ACE Kids Act, which is comprehensive and thought through Congress, saved 300,000 kids all across the nation from healthcare. Then, on our second argument on policy reversals, presidents now only enact their own unilateral agenda, which leads to unstable policy. They just say 75% are not revoked. That doesn't matter. It's the ones that are highly politically charged that do. For example, on immigration and climate change, that do the most damage. Then they cross-apply a bunch of stuff on COVID and Reagan. I'll address it on their case, but they say we should have seen fluctuations. What is not a fluctuation about climate change policy? That 25,000 people have died every single year because we don't have clear regulation and emissions are increasing. What is not clear fluctuation? When 135 million kids, immigrants, do not have clarification on what legal policy the U.S. has for them. These are proven empirics that you know that policy instability does hurt these people because regulations keep changing and no one knows how to adapt, which means we cannot pass long-term policy. Then they say that losing, again, I'll address the checks argument on their case. And then lastly, they say Biden is decreased emissions. But again, this was only during his term. The problem is that these are immediately reversed, so there's no actual long-term policy like climate change requires a long-term solution. With that said, let's talk about their arguments. They have presented the thesis that Congress is slow, but we would argue that this deliberation is a good thing. In order to pass good policy, you need deliberation and representatives from all over. But secondly, Hamilton finds that during times of crisis, Congress can act extremely quickly because we recognize the need. Rather, in all their examples, you're going to see the fact that A, Congress acted quicker, or B, every single executive order that they sign was authorized by Congress through statutory authority, which means we don't need executive orders. Really quickly on the checks and balances, though. They say federal agencies have been, but those are appointed by the president, so they still serve them. Then they say courts can check them, but they are misrepresenting it. Their evidence on 79% only does not take into account appeals, which could be delayed. When you actually look at the ones that are overturned, our evidence finds that it's only 29%. But secondly, even if you don't buy that, the damage is already done. We can reverse the 12,000 public servants that Truman fired, the person who was the New York mayor-elect who was arrested by ICE, or the veterans who are now denied access because to healthcare because they don't have democratic political status or merit affiliation. It is far too late to reverse it, and courts take months, if not years, to report them. With that said, let's talk about their empirics, which you'll see Congress either acted quicker or we didn't need executive orders. Firstly, on the economy, they give you the example of Reagan, but this was actually a bipartisan support by Congress. Not only did they pass the ERTA, which was one of the most bipartisan pieces of legislation, but they also passed the TRA 96, which again was historical bipartisan legislation, meaning that we didn't need executive orders to enact most of the economic tax cuts. That's why during the 2008 recession, Obama or Bush didn't even need any executive orders. They got it all from statutory authority by Congress. The same thing happened during COVID, with Glassman finds that before the first executive orders were introduced, 3 different bills were signed, including the CARES Act, which was the largest economic stimulus package in history, including Operation Warp Speed, which delegated the funding for vaccine management.
Thank you. First question.
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah. Let's talk about the 100,000 deaths. Read me the line in your evidence that says 100,000 people died from HIV deaths.
I can pull up my computer.
I can also pull up your evidence.
Yeah,
Right.
so
It says a 90-day PEPFAR funding could result in over 100,000 excess deaths. Is that not hypothetical?
So people are, I just want to clarify, people are dying from USID cuts right now because they haven't been revoked. It is a very clear fault.
First of all, on the Supreme Court decision on 5-4, they actually ordered Trump to restore once. Second, and
no, they haven't.
I can give you the evidence. Second, and right.
So would you read me the Supreme Court case right now?
It was a 5-4 decision.
What was the name of the court case?
I don't have the name of the court case off the top of my head. What I do know is that you have no evidence saying that people have actually died from these USAID cuts.
No, the projection is about it's a projected study about 300,000 dying, but either way, it is undeniable that the USAID cuts that happened have killed people.
In rebuttal, you told me 100K already died. I just disproved that. You have no evidence that it actually happened.
So you would say USAID is like cuts are a good thing?
No, I'm saying that they got checked by the courts, and you have no evidence that there was actual.
We would love to see the Supreme Court case that didn't happen, but I'm going to take a question. Yeah. So let's talk about this argument on Reaganomics. You tell me that economic deregulation and tax cuts were important, right? So what were these passed by?
Right. Okay, so there's two problems with your argument. First of all, you just cite me a bunch of bipartisan Congress bills that were signed in the 1980s with no impact. Our argument is specific to an executive order. It's not. No, our argument is not about Reaganomics. It's specifically about an executive order that was signed in 1980 that was separate from Reagan's economic policy.
No.
All it said was implementing a cost-benefit analysis regulation to economic regulations. What that does is not only did it lift us out of the recession.
How did that help? How did that lift us out of the recession?
Okay, so if you want me to get into the weeds of it, basically, whenever heads of agencies like economic agencies pass a regulation, there's not really that many checks on it. What Reagan did was he put a check on it by saying you have to implement.
That was not the policy that Reagan enacted to get us out of the recession.
Analysis.
You told me originally that the economic deregulation and tax cuts were the reason why it's cost benefit analysis. Yes, cost benefit analysis is an independent executive order.
That was the executive order that we cited.
Congress got us out of the recession through different multiple bipartisan actions.
Right. At the end of the day, you just state two bills with no impacts. I give you an executive order with impact. I'll take a question. Let's talk about your argument on Truman. You tell me that Truman had some really bad executive orders, right?
Yeah.
Truman also desegregated the military and sped up desegregation by 5 years. If there's good and bad examples on both sides, but the good ones always go through, all the bad ones get checked, why is it on net producing more harms?
Again, so one, we say that bad policy cannot necessarily reverse. The 12,000 public servants that were unjustly fired because of baseless accusations and communist accusations lost their jobs, their homes, and their lives.
Desegregation and racialization.
Desegregation argument. Even if you bring this up entirely new in your next speech, the desegregation that we would have talked about would have already been crossed by Congress.
Why wasn't it? Why wasn't it when Truman signed the executive order? Our evidence.
No, there was extreme congressional sentiment after World War II.
Our Wetzel evidence specifically finds that a lot of Congress did not. That Congress did not want it.
For summary.
Yeah, we'll take prep starting. Okay, so it was a minute and 57 seconds.
Correct.
is just going to be defending our arguments, doing the comparative, and then moving on to news. Is anyone not ready? Our narrative is that when Congress cannot act, we cannot rest our laurels on them. They have conceded that just last year, because of partisan splits, Congress is not able to pass legislation. The first thing that they tell you is that slow deliberation is good, but not when all that Congress does is talks. They cite you multiple bills that Congress has passed, but that doesn't actually analyze the impact of them. They tell you that things like the CARES Act passed, but look at the actual impacts. The CARES Act appropriated $2.2 trillion in funds that were mismanaged and had no impact. When this Congress was trying to pass the second round of stimulus checks, they weren't able to do so, so Trump signed 4 executive orders. All of our history proves that during times of crisis, executive orders are what fills in. They say there's no checks and balances because Trump just goes to the appeals courts. But our evidence concludes that when he goes to the Supreme Court, which is the highest level of court, he ends up losing. They don't give you examples. We will. When he tried to ban funding to sanctuary cities, he got blocked by the Supreme Court. When he tried to ban things like birthright and citizenship, he got blocked by the Supreme Courts. But more importantly, they have conceded that there's things like voter turnout that also check executive action. When Trump used executive orders to roll out ICE raids, voters didn't like it, so he had to roll them back. But more importantly, the damage isn't always done. Sure, maybe there are a few bad examples, but they have conceded that there's things like preliminary injunctions that prevent the executive orders from always going through, which is why when you look at broader examples in the broader system itself, it's not flawed, it's about the person holding the weapon, not the weapon itself. The easiest place to sign your ballot is our second argument on pandemics. It is cold conceded in their last speech. They have conceded that during COVID, through things like executive action and Trump speeding up the vaccination process, we saved 8 million lives. Biden was able to ensure that we had things like medical insurance for 15 million Americans that brought us out of the pandemic. This clean conceded with no defense. This is the comparative. First, our argument is a fundamental prerequisite to theirs. Absent getting out of COVID, we would have things like economic crashes that prevent us from focusing on things like climate change in the first place. If you aren't able to lift us out of have a good economy because of things like pandemics, you aren't able to have the investment or infrastructure to focus on climate change. But second and more importantly, our case also fundamentally turns theirs. If during times like COVID, you have to focus on the crisis itself, things like climate change are put in the back seat and not focused on, which means if you care about their impacts, you should also care about ours. Let's talk about their arguments. The first thing that they say is that executive orders have overall increased, but they don't look at broader trends. We analyze the last 75 years and conclude that although there are some small fluctuations, the overall trend is going down, which is true over the last 5 administrations, which means that there is no executive overreach. But specifically on their argument about climate change, all of their impacts are largely projectionary and they don't do the comparative. Sure, maybe some people might die, but it's all has to do with the future. You know that millions of lives have been saved. Biden has been able to pass executive orders that have decreased emissions by 30%. And when you know that millions of people have historically been saved because of things like executive orders and the impacts of climate change have big question marks on them, you're voting aft.
argument you're voting on today is our argument on policy reversal. We tell you that because executive orders are constantly reversed at such a high rate, we never actually see policy staying in the long term. That's why we saw that with climate policy, we went into the Paris Accords, we left it, and then we went into it again, and we never actually saw long-term solutions. That's why 25,000 people died each year from climate emissions. With DACA, immigration policy, we saw that 135 people or kids were left without clarification about how they would stay in the country because it was reversed so many times. These abuses are not just like short-term impacts that we don't care about. They are deaths and real lives that we should evaluate in this debate, and it's really unjust for us to say that we should prioritize the future and that these lives don't matter at all. Essentially, their only responses here is that we should focus on the overall trend of whether executive orders are increasing or decreasing. However, they forget Daniel's specific examples of how Biden's second term, he was not passing a lot of stuff. But during the overall trend of the most recent presidencies, we actually saw a record number of executive orders, and we always see that the amount of executive orders passed in the last couple of months significantly increased. But then they say that although some people might die, you look to the future. Again, don't let them justify this. We're winning the weighing debate on a prereq. We tell you that right now, we only see short-term policy being passed with the executive branch. However, long-term policy like the ACA Kids Act, which allowed for 300,000 kids to get access to healthcare across state lines, is a long-term solution that was never cut. What if we continue to prioritize the short-term policy, we never see solutions to issues like climate change. Their arguments are also not really great. Let's go to their case. Let's cross-apply our weighing to theirs. They give you this prerequisite of how we wouldn't have gotten out of COVID if we didn't have the executive branch. However, that's completely not true. Let's respond to their COVID argument. What they say we dropped in the last speech. It was not dropped. What actually we said was that Daniels told you that Congress appropriated 3 bills. $2.2 billion was not nothing. It actually allowed for us to get out of COVID, which means that Congress was actually the one who did the solution, not the executive branch. And at the point where they also dropped the response that Project Warp Speed was appropriated via the bills that Congress passed, we know that Warp Speed allowed for vaccines and PPE to be distributed, meaning that all the healthcare impacts flow to our side in this debate, and we win our prereq, not theirs. But then, they also don't respond to the fact that statutory powers passed through Congress allow for executive branch to step in when crises happen. But not only that, Congress has acted first in so many different ways. We saw that when we had issues like climate, the first bill was actually, issues like COVID, we saw the first bill was actually passed via Congress. But then, they tell you this argument about preliminary injunctions mean that we have checks on it. But remember, they don't actually prove that these preliminary injunctions happen for every single bad executive order. At that point, you believe that the bad executive orders that we've listed to you have the abuses already happening in today's world. If you want to vote for the side of this debate that's actually evaluating the real effects on balance of executive orders, you're always voting neg on policy reversal. It's so clean for the neg.
Let me know when you guys are ready.
Yeah.
Time starts. You tell me that Congress passed things for the executive, right? When was the CARES Act signed?
We're not talking about the CARES Act. We're talking about the two bills
Yeah.
that were preliminary to the CARES Act. Can I respond to your question first before you interrupt me? We're talking about the preliminary bills that were passed before the executive order that set up the CARES Act. What Congress does is they deliberate. That's why those two bills were smaller stimulus bills that allowed them time to implement the CARES Act.
One of them was a mental health bill. Secondly, if all you're saying the impact of the first two bills was to impact out to the third bill, and the third bill mismanaged funds, clearly we're not seeing any benefits from Congress.
Funds?
Right.
The CARES Act, if I could finish, the CARES Act included the provision of Operation Warp Speed, which is the foundation for vaccine production, which you have told us in every single speech is the reason why we got out of COVID.
So two things. First of all, out of rebuttal, that was a 5-second blip. But second and more importantly, you have still conceded that specifically the CARES Act, although it had $2 trillion, as you keep love to say, you didn't actually do anything because Congress wasn't able to agree on where to appropriate funds. That's why executive action.
If you think about it intuitively, let's say you guys are right? Let's say the CARES Act passed first.
Wait,
if I can finish, let's say the CARES Act passed first and it was great for mandating, speeding up the production of vaccines. Then why did Trump have to go and sign more executive orders to speed up vaccine production more?
And why was Congress unable to pass a second stimulus bill if they're so great during COVID? Why did Trump have to sign 4 executive actions to save millions of Americans?
I think
there's too many questions and not enough answers on your side.
So let's ask them. I think you're misunderstanding the argument. One, we can both agree that Congress can act quicker, proven by the fast stimulus bill, even though it was a preliminary one.
We don't agree that Congress can act
Can you
quicker.
interrupt? Can you let us respond, please?
The second argument is that Trump all of his executive orders were from statutory authority. The CARES Act contained the provisions in Operation Warp Speed to give vaccine production and authorize the president to make them, which is why even though he signed executive orders, they didn't need to happen because it's statutory authority in the bill.
If you're going to tell me that the president's executive orders only happen from authority given by the CARES Act, Executive Orders 1399 to 1311, all three of them were passed before the CARES Act was signed into law, which means your argument fundamentally has no logic.
Also, there are statutory provisions. Wait, you're right. Like, there are statutory provisions through Congress, but those are checks by Congress. They're not like different pieces of legislation that Congress is passing to solve. They're checks on executive orders that make them good.
No, it just proves that you don't need an executive order to do it. If the statutory authority that is given in legislation is already provided, you don't need an executive order to go around legislation. He just did it as a public statement to increase oxygen.
Okay, that's fine. We can do 2.5 minutes. Or we can take another.
Yeah, we'll take one. So, like, even how many preliminary injunctions were filed for Truman's executive order on public service?
Right. So you can name one executive order. That's great. Our canon.
What about veteran health care?
Our canon evidence is really, really good. It says on net, most of Trump's rulings in courts right now, the ones that haven't been ruled on, are facing preliminary injunctions, meaning that you can win the one or two examples, but most of them are being held. Read the canon.
That's one president and one term.
We'll run the rest of 1 minute or so.
Yeah, it's gonna be 11 seconds.
A minute 11. My judges, I'm the Archbishop, the second speaker from 1237 on the Pro, and the order of my speech is just to be public. I begin. Here is what you know and what has not been contested at any point in this round. They have conceded that specifically through executive orders, 8 million Americans are vaccinated. They have conceded specifically through executive orders, 15 million Americans who are hanging on by a thread got medical insurance to save their lives during COVID. And they have conceded that Biden passed 30 consecutive COVID executive orders, and when Congress was gridlocked in the second stimulus bill, we saw Trump pass 4 executive actions to save millions of American lives. That's probability weighing for you right there. Every historical empiric is on our side. But secondly, let's look to the alternatives if there is no executive orders. They tell you Congress solves, but out of their last speech, they not only have conceded that congressional gridlock is increasing absent of executive orders, but even in times of crisis, we are not seeing Congress pass bills. Also, that's a fundamental turn on their case. If Congress can't pass any bills, that means even without executive orders, they have no long-term climate policy solutions to fix the problem that they say we're in right now. They don't get any solvency. But secondly, let's go to this argument on overreach. We are going to tell you that right now, Trump is losing 75% of his court rulings, and the ones that haven't been ruled on face preliminary injunctions. That is our canon's evidence. It's the best piece of evidence in the round, and it looks holistically at most court rulings and tells you that Trump is being checked in the courts. They can tell you 1 or 2 bad apples, but if most of them are being checked, and the good executive orders have saved millions of American lives, you can feel very, very comfortable voting for us. Our argument is that in times of pandemics, it is very, very clear that executive action is the one that saves us, not Congress. All they tell you is that Congress passed the first bills. No, they didn't. We saw 3 executive actions before the CARES Act, which mismanaged funds. Then all they tell you on our prereq that the climate change takes a back seat is that Congress once again solves. But if they don't actually respond to the fact that congressional gridlock exists right now, that means that if we are focusing on times of crises, they don't actually have any sort of solvency for climate change, it takes a back seat. But go to their case. On the argument about whiplash, you can't reverse saving lives. These lives have already been saved. We already have access to our impact. But secondly, if Biden on net reversed emissions, they don't have any sort of solvency proving that Trump reduced it. It's projectionary. If you're voting for American lives, if you're voting for history, it's really clearly out.
I'll talk about crisis cases like COVID, and then I'll talk about policy reversal. They have told you that things are uncontested and around like their impacts, but we have argued that if absent executive order, Congress would have done it a lot faster, which is proven, and their only example on COVID. They say gridlock is increasing, but we have isolated that this deliberation is important, but rather in times of actual crisis, in their own example, Congress was a lot faster. Let's talk about COVID. Before executive orders were even introduced, 3 different bills, 2 of them which came first and set up the CARES Act, were passed with 4 executive orders, and additionally, the CARES Act is literally their argument. They have conceded that during times of crisis, Congress offloads additional statutory authority laws that give the president the power to address emergency, which means you didn't need executive orders. And in their own example, you did not hear the words Operation Warp Speed in their last speech. The reason is because the ability to make vaccines and mobilize the production and authorize the funding was all through Congress, through Operation Warp Speed and the vaccine bills, which means you didn't need executive orders in the first place. Then they give this argument on checks and balances. But even if most of them are checked, you can't prove that every single one of them is checked, which means that 1, you didn't need executive orders in the first place because Congress would have solved it first or given statutory authority. But then 2, you can't reverse the 12,000 servers that Truman fired or the people and the veterans who don't have access to health care. We're not saying that every single one has to be checked, but the ones that don't or the ones that do lasting damage and are actual numbers in the round that you can very comfortably vote on. They cannot access this prerequisite if we can prove that Congress acting first. The only thing you do know is that the ones that are negative have negative effects. Even then, the argument on policy reversal is undercovered. We say that presidents not only act their own unilateral agenda and reverse the previous order, which means that we can't get anything productive, which is a conceded prerequisite. Because in the long run, in order to pass long-term policy for things like climate change, we need long-term policy, but you can't pass it if we're just constantly reversing it, which is why 25,000 people have died every single year. They say Biden saved a couple lives, but that doesn't matter because it's immediately reversed, and climate change is a long-term policy. And also, the empiric on DACA has dropped, where 135 million immigrants across the country do not have legal say, all of which are numbers that you know are true. If you want to vote on actual long-term policy, we shouldn't have executive orders.